So please welcome to the stage, Claire Alexander.
Is that working? Can you hear me? Yeah, I wanted to be really careful what I said, so I've written it down, and also the barrier is probably a good thing. Okay, so really a change of pace. I really apologise. I took this as a very serious exercise, which clearly that wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. But firstly, I do want to thank Inez and her colleagues for inviting me to speak at today's event and for starting this whole series of kind of events in Manchester. I must confess, when I first heard about this initiative, I was a little bit sceptical. Largely, I have to say, because of the acronym, which someone pointed out to me was PAW, or if you had International Postdoc Appreciation Week, IPAW, which seemed to be a whole different version of what a career might look like in the academy. But it has been really important in terms of raising my awareness and knowledge and experience of the experiences and issues facing postdocs in the university, particularly outside of my own area, my own school and faculty. So I guess, to one extent, job done, right? I'm going to start with a few disclaimers so that I can manage your expectations. So firstly, Inez asked me to come along and be inspirational or motivational. I'm not going to be able to do either of those things. In the unlikely event you go away feeling either inspired or motivated, it's entirely unintentional. I accept absolutely no responsibility for anything you might decide to do after this. I also don't offer myself as a role model or example of how to succeed in the academy. In fact, pretty much as a single childless workaholic, I'm absolutely not what you should be aiming for. So take it as a warning, maybe. Secondly, I'm aware that what I'm going to say largely comes out of experiences, or exclusively comes out of the experiences of humanities and social sciences. And so I suspect a lot of what I'm going to say doesn't apply to those of you in STEM disciplines, which I think probably is most of you, I guess, around the room. The career path for postdocs in humanities is still comparatively straightforward. It's still, I'm sure that most of the postdocs in that area don't feel this, but there is at least the assumption or the possibility that most doctoral graduates will do perhaps 1 or possibly 2 stints as a postdoc on some kind of temporary lectureship before moving on to a permanent post. And I know that that's more and more difficult for people coming out of STEM subjects. So some of this may not apply. The third disclaimer is I'm not going to spend my time bemoaning the state of the academy and the structures that constrain us. Let's take for granted that we all recognise the downsides of a neoliberal university and also the pressures that the university sector is under. I'm sure we would all like our universities and our workplace and conditions to be better, though I suspect we may not all want them to be better in the same way. So let's set aside the structural issues as something that we can't do that much about at this point and concentrate on agency, so on the things that we can actually do in our own lives. So I'm going to take you very briefly first through a few kind of key highlights of my career in the academy as a woman of colour, and then offer you a few practical tips, which may or may not be of any use to you whatsoever. Okay, so let's start off by stating the obvious. That academics of colour and women of colour in particular are underrepresented in the academy, and that universities have been very slow at recognising, let alone addressing, issues of inequality around gender or race or disability or sexuality, class as well. Because of this, I think it's quite hard for academics of colour to make a plan, and actually this refers back to something that was said earlier. The traditional pathways through the academy are not designed fairly obviously for those who are non-traditional. So while my career often looks from the outside as if it's been seamlessly and ruthlessly plotted, apparently I have a reputation for being ruthlessly careerist, from the inside it feels like a series of accidents. So I finished my PhD in social anthropology in Oxford in 1993. I worked then for a year on a postdoc there, which was mainly looking after kind of drunken students actually, so it wasn't even a real postdoc. I very soon discovered that I couldn't get a job in anthropology because my PhD was on Black British youth. And firstly, work at home was not considered proper anthropology. And secondly, that work on race really wasn't considered to be a proper topic for anthropology. I got a temporary post in Southampton as a lecturer, but I also applied for a British Academy postdoc, which everyone told me I wouldn't get. So one lesson I guess to take away is never listen to what people tell you can or you can't do, because you don't know. But I went to work with Stuart Hall at the Open University, where I did my project on the Asian gang. When I came out of that 3 years later, the bar for getting a job in the academy had already risen quite dramatically. I applied, I think, for over 30 jobs before I finally got a temporary lectureship, coincidentally back at Southampton. On my first day in Southampton, a professor in the department offered to help me carry my books to my office. On the way over, he told me that no one had wanted me to get the job because there was an internal candidate, and I'd only got it because the university felt they needed a black face. Oh, and wasn't I a good friend, in inverted commas, of the head of department? I left Southampton after 2 years to go to South Bank in London. When I got that job, a colleague spread the rumour that I'd got the job because I was sleeping with the head of department, and because they wanted someone black. You get a sense of the pattern here. I moved 5 years later to the LSE, taking a demotion from senior lecturer to lecturer. I was the first person to have been employed, the first person of colour to be employed on a permanent post in the sociology department ever. On my first day at a departmental meeting, the head of department thanked me and one other ethnic minority colleague who'd arrived on a fixed-term contract at the same time for, quote, bringing a bit of colour into the department. Although he was referring, actually, it turned out to what we were wearing, but I'm thinking about it afterwards, that's not actually better. Later, a so-called feminist colleague at the Gender Institute told me that I'd been appointed because the head of department liked to surround himself, quote, with younger women of colour. I was at the LSE for 9 years, was promoted to reader, but a later head of department, another so-called feminist, white feminist, told me that I would never get a chair because they didn't promote women and they didn't consider race research to be proper work. When I was a targeted appointment for a chair in Manchester, a senior, highly respected white male colleague with several decades of work in race asked me if I was sure I'd actually been offered the job and not just been asked to apply for it, because my English is clearly not very good. One of my PhD students, another white male, said to me, Manchester or Manchester Met? And then followed it up with, are you friends with the head of department there? So that's up to 7 years ago. And this resume doesn't include the very famous professor who complimented me on the quality of the writing in the art of being black and then said, you must have had a very good editor. The warden of Goldsmiths, who in a job interview asked me if The Asian Gang was a real book. Or the chair of an ethics committee here in Manchester, who quoted Kipling to me when questioning my 20 years of research experience, ending up quoting, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. So I'm telling you this litany of minor humiliations, not just to show that I can really, really, really bear a grudge, but mainly to show that the Academy has always been a hard place for people whose face doesn't fit, and that never really goes away, even as you get a permanent post and even as you become more senior. Hopefully, though, for those of you that are finding your way in a place that either doesn't see you or doesn't like what it sees when it does see you, it does at least hopefully make you feel that you're not alone. And if it's not exactly light at the end of the tunnel, then there are at least some points of solidarity along the way. So in the spirit of which, I offer you a few tips from my own experience, which, as I said, you may or may not like and may or may not find useful. So the first thing is, do the work. So one of the things that has changed since I started out is that, although it doesn't seem like it, the Academy now is much more open, more diverse and more transparent than it has ever been. Certainly in the social sciences, there are less jobs for the boys. And certainly things like Athena Swan and the Race Charter Mark have put issues of equality on the agenda. I mean, there are issues about how effective we think those have been, but there are at least questions that are being asked now. Also, and I know this is a double-edged tool, things like the ref at least provide clear benchmarks for what we're meant to be doing. So use those, know what those are, use them to meet the expectations of colleagues and employers. And then you have something to fight with. At least when you're not getting the job, you'll have a good reason to ask why, right? I think of this as covering your back. I also think there's more space than there has been for alternative kinds of work. Public engagement and impact has meant that different media, publications, activities are valued. This does allow more space for diverse voices and approaches to scholarship. So in the humanities and social sciences, the debates around decolonising the curriculum, for example, have changed the way in which we're having to think about who needs to be heard and who needs to be here. So there are ways of engaging with those expectations. You have to engage with those expectations. You have to play that game. But once you're playing the game, then you can try and kind of change it. You can't do it from outside. The second lesson I learned is apply for everything. That's what I always tell my PhD students. They always look horrified, but it really is. You have to apply for everything that's going when you're starting out. There's no job that you're too good for. In most cases, and certainly if you don't have kind of family money to fall back on, then you don't have a choice. So don't just hang around, wait to see if Manchester will offer you a job. They probably won't. And don't rule out post-92 universities because the conditions are worse, or the status is poor, or the job is somewhere you don't like, or it has too much teaching, or whatever. None of us ever start out where we want to end up. When I took the job at South Bank, I was teaching 12 hours a week, face-to-face teaching, and the line from the Dean of Faculty was if you wanted to do research and writing, you had to do it at evenings and weekends. The best career advice I ever got was to take the job that gets you nearer to where you want to be. So in this case, when I moved to South Bank, it was because I wanted a permanent post and I wanted to be back in London. Then write yourself out. Right, so take the time, and yeah, it might involve evenings and weekends, but do that. So do what you have to do, take the opportunities that come along, and have an escape plan. Thirdly, be realistic, and this is about balance. And this is, I probably shouldn't say this given that I'm the school research director, but I do think there's often too much emphasis on research and research excellence, which leads people to think that it's the only thing that matters. Often the academy, I think, seems like a really boring intellectual version of the X Factor. It isn't. Most of us are not going to change the world through our work. Most of us will never be a Foucault or a Bourdieu or a Stuart Hall or a Judith Butler. And even if we are, that doesn't really make a difference to most people outside the academy. And if most of you in the room are going, who? That kind of tells you everything you need to know. Honestly, I've been working on race equality for 25 years, and I often think I could have achieved more if I'd just learned to bake. So perhaps the most important thing that any of us will do is teach. Not just because this is where most of our wages come from. In humanities and social sciences, 80% of the money coming into those departments is from teaching. But it's also because it's where we can actually shape minds and make a difference in the world. My time at South Bank was incredibly frustrating and exhausting, but it allowed me to see the difference that we really can make to the people that we reach through teaching, and it was much more satisfying than I ever felt teaching the international elite at the LSE. Fourthly, get support. Academic life is pretty isolating. The emphasis on individual success does generate competition and anxiety. On top of that, if your face doesn't fit, it can be a pretty difficult world to navigate. So my advice is get a group of people who you trust, who get who you are and understands the struggles that you face. This may be peers, it may be mentors, it may not be people from your own institution or your own team, it may not be formalised in any way. I've been very lucky to have benefited from the advice and opportunities given by a number of senior colleagues, mainly actually white, mainly men, across the course of my career. Now, as a senior academic, I try to do the same for younger colleagues, particularly colleagues, scholars of colour, or those whose faces, for whatever reason, don't fit. But don't try and go it alone. So in SOS, Social Sciences, we've developed a policy for research contract staff, which builds in some support for career development. This is my plug for the Social Sciences. So this policy provides mentors, it provides a £1,000 annual research support allowance for people to develop their own careers, go to conferences that are not tied to the work they're employed on. A 1 day a week research time for developing their own publications, and a network coordinator to develop training between research contract staff so they don't feel so alone, and to identify training and support needs. But there are also informal mechanisms. So take the opportunities that come up to get involved in your department or your academic field. Do things like that you can't obviously see the benefit of initially. Things like book reviews or funding reviews or journal article reviews, those kind of things. All of these help to build your profile, but also they provide kind of connections and opportunities that can be invaluable and can lead to quite surprising things. And the final point, I think this came up again in the first presentation, is try and keep your passion. And it is kind of the reverse of the first point, although it really, about doing the work, but it shouldn't be. So try and keep the passion for your work, whatever area it's in. What was the thing that brought you into the academy in the first place? It almost certainly wasn't for the money, it certainly wasn't for the job security. The modern university is very good at making us worry a lot about our careers, but less about the intellectual thing that brought us into the PhD and kept us here, so the problem or the issue that you were wanting to understand or change. And here I'm channeling my main mentor and inspiration, Stuart Hall, who was, I don't know if most of you may not have heard of him, but he was a black sociologist who was committed to understanding race, class, and identity. And he always drew a very clear distinction between being an academic which he was slightly scathing of, with all the kind of careerist stuff that comes with that. And being an intellectual, so the focus on the issues, on the understanding, on communication, or on change. He once asked colleagues, "Why are you in this field if you don't care about changing the world?" He died a few years ago, and I went to his memorial service, and 3 things really struck me. Firstly, that he worked really hard, really hard, even when, from the outside, it looked like it all looked really easy, and he could just wander around the world being Stuart Hall. So do the work, even when it's difficult or demanding or unrewarding. Secondly, that intellectual work is a privilege and a vocation, and it shouldn't just be reduced to being an individual career. It's a collective endeavour. And thirdly, that intellectual work requires generosity, empathy, care of self and of others, and in my case, lots of tea and cake. So, thanks.